He told everyone he was leaving for a 3-day business trip. He kissed his daughters goodbye, loaded his bags into the car, and drove exactly 4 blocks before turning around. Something felt wrong, not broken, just off the way a room smells different when someone's been through it. He slipped back through the side gate like a stranger to his own home, walked straight to the security room, and sat down in the dark. What played out on those monitors over the next 12 hours would cost him everything he thought he knew. Charles Whitmore had built his fortune the same way he did everything else, by moving fast, trusting his instincts, and never looking back. By 44, he owned 3 companies, a Manhattan penthouse, and a 12-room house in Connecticut that he mostly used on weekends when guilt got louder than his calendar. He was the kind of man who could close a deal at midnight and still make it home in time to leave a note on the breakfast table. But notes weren't the same as presents, and somewhere deep down he knew it. His wife Claire had understood that about him. She never complained. She just kept the house warm, and the girls laughing, and she covered the distance he left without making it feel like a wound. When she died quietly, the way she did everything, the house stopped feeling like a home and started feeling like a structure he was responsible for maintaining. His daughters Grace and Sophie were 6 and 8 when they lost her. They were 9 and 11 now, and they had learned the way children of busy fathers do to need less out loud. Vanessa came into his life 18 months later through a charity gala where she wore a red dress and laughed at exactly the right moments. She was 37, polished and careful in the way that only people who've studied other people tend to be. She knew when to be warm and when to step back. She knew how to make Charles feel seen without making him feel crowded. By the time he introduced her to Grace and Sophie, he had already decided she was the answer to something he hadn't found the words to name. Maria had been with the family for 6 years. She arrived 2 months before Claire's diagnosis, hired to help with the house, and ended up helping with everything else. She drove Sophie to violin practice, braided Grace's hair before school, and kept a tin of cinnamon cookies on the top pantry shelf because Claire had loved them. She was quiet and steady and entirely without agenda, the kind of person who becomes invisible to adults, but essential to children. The girls didn't just like her. They relied on her the way you rely on something you've stopped noticing because it's always been there. Vanessa noticed Maria right away, and what she saw, Charles would only understand later, was a problem. It started small, the way most dangerous things do. One evening after the girls were in bed, Vanessa sat beside Charles on the couch with a glass of wine and a tone that was careful to sound reluctant. She said she hated to bring it up. She said she was probably wrong. Then she said that she'd noticed Maria getting a little too comfortable, the way she spoke to the girls, the way they ran to her. First, the way she moved through the house like she belonged to it. Charles set down his glass. "Maria's been here 6 years," he said. "She's good with them." Vanessa nodded slowly, like she was absorbing his answer and filing it somewhere. "That's exactly what worries me," she said. She didn't push. She never pushed. She just planted the thought and let it sit there like a seed in dark soil, and then over the following weeks, she watered it. Little things went missing: his watch, then a set of cufflinks, then a bottle of wine from the cellar. Vanessa never accused directly. She just mentioned them casually in that soft voice she used when she wanted him to hear something, without feeling like she was saying it. The refrigerator was always low on the girls' snacks. The house accounts showed small irregularities. Someone had moved things in his office. Each detail alone meant nothing. Together they built a shape that looked exactly like what Vanessa needed it to look like. What wore him down most wasn't the accusations. It was the framing. Vanessa always wrapped her concern in love for him, for the girls, for the family she said she was trying to protect. She would reach for his hand and squeeze it like a warning, dressed as affection. She would say she wasn't trying to cause trouble. She was just paying attention, so he didn't have to. And Charles, who had spent 20 years trusting his gut in boardrooms, found himself second-guessing it at home. He knew Maria. He had watched her grieve alongside this family quietly and without asking for anything. But doubt is a patient thing. It doesn't need to be loud to do its work. The decision to fake the trip came to him at 2 in the morning, 2 weeks after Vanessa first mentioned Maria's name, with that particular softness. He lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, and thought about his daughters, about the way they had gone a little quieter lately, about the small hesitations he'd noticed when he asked them how things were. He thought about Maria, who had never once given him a real reason for suspicion, and he thought about Vanessa, who had given him every reason to trust her, and somehow still left him feeling like he was standing on a floor he hadn't fully inspected. He decided that the only way to know the truth was to remove himself from it and watch what happened in the space he left behind. He announced the trip at dinner the following night. 3 days in Chicago, he said. Meetings he couldn't move. Vanessa smiled and told him he was doing the right thing. She smoothed the collar of his jacket with both hands, the way someone tidies something before putting it away, and said that sometimes you had to step back to see clearly. He kissed his daughters goodnight and told them he'd call every evening. Sophie held onto his sleeve a beat longer than usual. Grace didn't say anything. She just watched him walk toward the door, with the kind of eyes that know something they can't yet say. He drove 4 blocks. Then he turned around. He came in through the side gate, avoided the kitchen, where he could already hear Vanessa's voice giving Maria instructions, and walked directly to the small security room off the back hallway, a space he'd installed 3 years ago after a break-in scare, and never used for anything but storing old cables. He pulled out the chair, sat down, and turned on the monitor panel. 12 feeds blinked to life in rows across the screen. The kitchen, the living room, the girls' hallway, the study, the front entrance, the back garden. The time in the corner read 7:41 in the evening. At first, the house looked like a house. Maria moved through the kitchen with a cloth wiping down the counters in the methodical way she always did. Grace sat at the kitchen island with a book open in front of her, but not reading it, her eyes tracking Vanessa the way a small animal tracks something larger in the same room. Sophie was on the living room floor with a puzzle spread out across the rug, her shoulders slightly raised, like she was waiting for something she didn't want to name. The scene looked ordinary. It looked like a home on a quiet weeknight. Then Vanessa walked out of the pantry, and the temperature of the room changed. It wasn't one thing she did. It was the shift, the way her posture changed, the moment the front door had clicked shut behind Charles, hours earlier, like something she had been holding carefully in place was finally allowed to relax. Her voice, when she spoke to Maria, had none of the warmth Charles heard when she spoke to him. It was flat and precise, the voice of someone who had decided long ago that pleasantness was a tool and not a habit. She told Mariah to redo the kitchen shelves. She told Grace to close her book and go upstairs. She walked through the living room and kicked a puzzle piece sideways with the toe of her heel, and when Sophie looked up, Vanessa's expression didn't change. Not impatience, not irritation, just indifference, which is somehow worse. Charles leaned closer to the monitor. His hands were flat on the desk in front of him, very still. He was watching the house he had built with his own money and trying to understand why it looked on 12 small screens like a place his daughters were learning to survive. The security room was small and smelled like old dust and forgotten cables. Charles had not sat in it since the week it was installed, back when he'd been convinced someone was watching the property and turned out to be wrong. Now he sat in the same chair in the same dark and watched the house he thought he knew rearrange itself into something he didn't recognize. On the monitor, Vanessa moved from room to room with the ease of someone who had been waiting a long time for this much space, and the girls moved around her the way water moves around a stone, not fighting it, just finding the path of least resistance. Grace had stopped trying to make conversation with Vanessa somewhere around the second hour. Charles watched it happen, a small attempt, a question about dinner, Vanessa's flat non-answer, and then Grace simply closed off the way a window closes against cold air. She found Sophie in the upstairs hallway, and they sat together on the top step, without speaking, shoulders touching, listening to the sounds of the house below them. Charles had seen that posture before, not in his daughters and himself at 9 years old, in a house where the adults were angry, and the safest thing to do was go very still and very quiet. Vanessa called for Maria constantly, not by need, by reflex, the way someone exercises authority just to feel it working. Redo the flowers in the entryway. The back windows need wiping. Don't leave the laundry in the basket overnight. Each command arrived without a please and was received without a complaint, and Maria moved through all of it like water, finding its level calm and unhurried. But Charles noticed what Vanessa didn't bother to notice, that every time Maria finished one task and passed near the girls, something in their posture shifted. Their shoulders came down. Grace looked up. Sophie exhaled. It was so small that you'd miss it if you weren't watching for it, but Charles was watching for nothing else. Around 9 in the evening, Vanessa told the girls to go to bed. Not asked. Told in the tone you use on animals you've decided are not worth training. Grace said she wasn't tired. Vanessa turned toward her with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and said that tired wasn't the point, that the house needed to be quiet before her friends came by tomorrow, and that they should learn to manage themselves without Maria holding their hands every night. Sophie stood up from the step without a word and walked to her room. Grace followed, but she looked back once at the kitchen doorway, where Maria was standing with a dish towel in her hands, and the look between them carried more than anything said out loud. Maria brought them warm milk without being asked. Charles watched her climb the stairs with a small tray knock twice on Grace's door and disappear inside. She stayed for 11 minutes. He knew because he counted. When she came back down, her face was composed, but her jaw was set in a way that told him she was working to keep it that way. She went back to the kitchen, rinsed the mugs, and then stood at the sink for a moment, with her eyes closed and her hands braced against the edge of the counter, like someone gathering themselves after a long carry. Charles pressed his palm flat against the desk in front of him. He had sat in this room for nearly 3 hours, and in those 3 hours, every instinct he had trusted for 20 years had reversed itself completely. He had almost believed Vanessa. He had almost let her careful, patient campaign of doubt replace 6 years of evidence he had gathered, simply by being present in the same house as Maria. The watch, the cufflinks, the wine, the account irregularities, none of it had ever felt real to him the way Vanessa made it sound. But she had been so consistent, so gentle, so seemingly reluctant, that the doubt had taken root anyway. Sitting here now, he understood exactly how she had done it. She had studied him the way a locksmith studies a lock, learned which mechanisms were stiff, which ones were loose, and applied exactly the right pressure in exactly the right places. He was angry, but not yet done watching, because he needed to understand the full shape of it before he moved. The house settled into late quiet after 10. Vanessa's friends never came, that had apparently been invented for the girls' benefit, or for the pleasure of having a reason to send them away. She opened a bottle of wine in the kitchen, scrolled through her phone for a while, and then drifted toward the back of the house, where Charles's private study sat at the end of a narrow hallway. He had 2 cameras in that hallway. He hadn't thought about them in years. Now he leaned toward the monitor and watched Vanessa slow her walk as she approached the study door check, over her shoulder once, and then push it open. Charles felt the air leave his chest. The study was locked. He locked it every time he left the house out of habit, more than secrecy, the way you check a door, not because you expect trouble, but because the habit is older than the reason. Vanessa reached into the pocket of her robe and produced a small key, and the sight of it, the fact that she had one, that she had gotten one at some point, without mentioning it, that she had been waiting for exactly this kind of night, landed in his stomach like cold water. She went straight to the second drawer of the desk, Inside, under a folded document and a spare phone charger, sat a velvet box the size of a closed fist. Charles had put it there 11 months ago when he realized he couldn't keep it on the mantel any longer, because looking at it while Vanessa was in the room felt like a violation of something he couldn't name. The box held a diamond necklace, thin chain, 3 stones simple in the way only very expensive things can afford to be simple. Claire had worn it on their first real date, and on their wedding day, and on every occasion after that she considered worth dressing for. It was not the most valuable thing in the house, it was the most irreplaceable. Vanessa held it up to the lamp the way someone holds a glass of wine to check the color. She looked at it for a long moment, tilting it so the stones caught the light, and her expression was not one of greed or guilt or even satisfaction. It was the expression of someone executing a plan they had already decided was reasonable. She closed the box, slid it into her pocket, and walked back out of the study as quietly as she had entered. Charles did not move. He watched her cross the hallway, pass through the kitchen, and make her way to the staff room near the side entrance, a small functional space where Maria kept her overnight bag on the nights she stayed when the girls had bad dreams. Vanessa opened the bag with unhurried hands, pressed the velvet box down beneath a folded sweater, and rezipped the bag with the care of someone who understands that the details matter. Then she smoothed the fabric over it, once like a period at the end of a sentence, and walked back toward the main house without a backward glance. In the security room, Charles sat completely still. He had a phone in his hand, and he had not used it. Not because he didn't know what to do, but because the next move had to be right. Not fast. Right. The following morning arrived the way bad mornings often do, quietly, as if hoping no one will notice. Maria was already in the kitchen when Sophie and Grace came downstairs, and she had made the kind of breakfast that said, without words, that she had been thinking about them since the night before. Vanessa appeared at 9, composed and bright-eyed, wearing the kind of outfit people put on when they want to look effortless, but have worked at it. She smiled at the girls, asked if they slept well, and didn't wait for an answer. Then her hand went to her chest. "My necklace," she said, and her voice pitched upward just enough to cut through the room without quite becoming a shout. "The diamond necklace, it's gone." She turned in a slow circle, as if retracing steps she had never actually taken, and her eyes moved to Maria with the timing of someone who had practiced this. "I left it in the study last night. I was going to put it on this morning." Maria looked up from the counter. "Ma'am, I haven't been in the study." "I'm not accusing anyone," Vanessa said with the tone of someone who absolutely was. "I just think we should check, for everyone's peace of mind." She looked at the girls with an expression designed to read as concern. "It belonged to your father's late wife. I'd never forgive myself if something happened to it." Sophie's face tightened. Grace looked at Maria, then at Vanessa, then back at Maria, reading the room, the way children read rooms when adults have taught them, through example that something is always underneath the surface. Maria set down the dish towel in her hand and stood very straight. She did not look frightened. She looked like someone who already knows what is coming and has decided that dignity is the only thing left to control. "Search whatever you need to search," Maria said quietly. "I have nothing to hide." Vanessa smiled, brief, clean, already moving toward the staff room, and the smile was the worst part. Not triumphant, not cruel, just efficient. The smile of someone crossing the last item off a list they have been working through for a very long time. She walked to the side entrance with Sophie and Grace trailing behind her, like small witnesses called to a proceeding they hadn't agreed to attend, lifted Maria's overnight bag from its place beside the utility closet, and set it on the kitchen island with both hands. Charles was already moving through the side gate. He came through the kitchen door the same way he had left it the previous evening, quietly without announcement, as if the house hadn't been expecting him at all. He still had his jacket on from the night before. His tie was loosened, his eyes were steady, and the phone in his hand was already open to the security footage, with the timestamp visible at the bottom of the screen. He did not say good morning. He did not explain himself. He simply walked to the kitchen island where Vanessa was standing over Maria's open bag and said in a voice that had no room in it for argument, "Step away from that." Vanessa turned. For a fraction of a second, something moved across her face that she didn't have time to organize surprise calculation, and then the practiced recovery that Charles had watched her perform 100 times in social situations. She pressed one hand to her chest and let out a breath that was designed to sound like relief. "Charles, thank God. You're back early." She gestured toward the bag on the island. "I was just about to call you. Something's happened with the necklace, Claire's necklace. It's been missing since last night, and I found it. I know where you found it," Charles said. He set his phone face up on the counter between them. The screen showed Vanessa in the study. The timestamp read 10:37 in the evening. The kitchen went very quiet. Grace and Sophie stood in the doorway, frozen in the particular stillness of children who understand that the next few minutes will matter for a long time. Maria had not moved from her position beside the island. Her hands were open at her sides, not defensive, not pleading, just open the way you hold your hands when you've decided the truth is the only thing you have left to offer, and you're offering it completely. Vanessa looked at the phone. Then she looked at Charles. Then she smiled. And this time, the smile was different. Thinner, less rehearsed, the kind that appears when someone decides to try a different approach because the first one has been foreclosed. "Charles, I understand what that looks like," she said. "But if you'll let me explain, I went in to get something from the desk, and I saw the necklace was already out of the box. I was putting it somewhere safe until you got back. I was going to tell you, you went in with a key," Charles said. "A key you never mentioned having. At 10:37 at night after you told the girls to go to bed and told Maria to stay in the kitchen." He picked up the phone and moved to the next clip, Vanessa in the staff hallway, the bag open in her hands, the velvet box disappearing beneath a folded sweater. He turned the screen so it faced her fully. "And then you came here." Vanessa's smile held for 3 more seconds. Then it didn't. She changed tactics the way she always changed tactics, not by retreating, but by reframing, by finding the angle that still gave her ground to stand on. "You installed cameras in the staff quarters," she said, and there was an edge in her voice now, something sharp underneath the smooth surface. "That feels like a violation of 'It's my house,'" Charles said. Not loudly, not with heat, just the flat-tired certainty of a man who has run out of patience for a conversation that should never have needed to happen. Sophie stepped forward from the doorway. She was 11 years old, and she moved like someone twice that age, with the careful deliberateness of a child who has spent months measuring every word before she said it. "She put it there," Sophie said, looking at her father, not at Vanessa. "She went in your study. I heard her in the hallway. I didn't know what she was doing, but I heard her. And then I heard the staff room door." Vanessa turned toward Sophie with an expression that was clearly meant to be gentle and landed instead as a warning. "Sweetheart, you were supposed to be asleep. You didn't see." "I heard," Sophie said again, and her voice did not waver. Grace had moved to stand beside Maria without anyone noticing exactly when she'd done it. She wasn't touching her. Just standing close, shoulder to shoulder, the way you stand with someone when you want them to know they're not alone without making a production of it. When she spoke, her voice was smaller than Sophie's, but the words were not. "She's been mean to us the whole time you're not here," Grace said, looking at her father. "Not like yelling, just mean, like we're in her way, like Maria is in her way." She looked down for a moment, then back up. "Maria never lets her get too close to us. She always comes and stands there. Every time." Charles looked at his younger daughter for a long moment. The anger in his chest had not gone anywhere, but something else had moved in beside it. Something heavier and quieter. The specific weight of a parent who understands that his children have been carrying something he was supposed to prevent them from having to carry. He crouched down so he was level with Grace and asked her voice low, How long? Grace thought about it with the seriousness of a child who wants to get the answer right. Since she started staying here, she said. Charles stood up. He turned to face Vanessa fully, and what was in his expression was not rage. Rage would have been easier to manage. It was clarity, the kind that arrives after a long confusion and feels almost like grief, because it means all the time spent being confused was real and cannot be taken back. You used my daughters, he said. You used them as the backdrop for a performance I was supposed to witness from a distance. You took something that belonged to Claire, something that has no replacement, no equivalent, nothing I could substitute for it, and you put it in the bag of the one person in this house who has never given me a single real reason for doubt. And you did all of it with a smile in the language of protection, in the exact tone I was most likely to believe. Vanessa's chin lifted. You're making a decision in the middle of an emotional moment, she said. That's not like you. You're a man who looks at all the information before. I spent 14 hours looking at the information, Charles said. I have all of it. The quiet that followed was the kind that fills a room completely, the kind that leaves no space for a follow-up. Vanessa looked at him for a long moment, not calculating anymore, just looking as if she were trying to find one more door and realizing there were none. Then she straightened her posture in a way that was almost dignified and said, voice even, "You'll regret this." No, Charles said. I regret letting it get this far. He walked to the kitchen island, picked up the velvet box, and held it in both hands for a moment before setting it on the counter, away from the bag. Then he looked at Vanessa and said simply and without drama, "Pack your things. I'll have someone here by noon to help you move whatever you need moved. But you're not staying in this house another night." Vanessa looked at him one last time. There might have been something real in it Charles didn't know, and had realized by now that he was no longer equipped to read her accurately. Then she turned and walked out of the kitchen, her footsteps sharp and measured on the hardwood floor, and the sound grew smaller until the front staircase swallowed it. The three of them, Charles, Sophie, Grace, and Maria, stood in the kitchen and listened to the house breathe. It was Grace who moved first. She crossed the kitchen to her father and pressed her face against his ribs, and he put his arms around her without speaking. Sophie came a few seconds later, and he held them both, one hand on each of their backs, and did not say anything about being home or about things being okay, because they were both smart enough to know that okay was something you arrived at. Slowly, not something you announced. When he looked up, Maria was still standing where she had been. She was looking at the necklace box on the counter with an expression he couldn't fully read, something between relief and exhaustion. And underneath both of those, something older, the look of someone who has been proven right about something they never wanted to be right about. "Maria," Charles said. She looked at him. "I owe you an apology that I'm not sure I know how to make properly." He released his daughters gently and took 2 steps toward her. His voice was not the voice he used in boardrooms, or in negotiations, or in any of the spaces where he was accustomed to being in control. It was just his voice, rough at the edges, and without any performance in it. "I doubted you. Not fully, not finally, but I let the doubt exist, and I let it affect how I looked at you. And you deserved better than that from me. You have been in this house for 6 years. You were here when Claire was sick. You stayed after. You kept the girls steady when I was not paying close enough attention to notice they needed steadying. And I repaid that by sitting in a security room for 14 hours instead of trusting what I already knew." Maria pressed her lips together. Her eyes were bright. "You came back," she said. "That's what matters." "I should have seen it sooner," he said. "You saw it," she said quietly. "That's what matters." Sophie was watching this from beside the island, with the expression children wear when adults say something that rearranges how they understand the world. Grace had not let go of her father's sleeve. Charles looked at both of them, and then back at Maria, and said the thing he had been deciding since 10:30 the previous night, when he watched her stand in the hallway with her shoulders squared and her hands still. "I want you to stay," he said. "Not as the housekeeper, not as someone this house employs and can let go of when the situation changes. I want you to stay because you are already part of what this family is, and I should have said that out loud a long time ago." Maria looked at the girls. Grace gave a small, firm nod, the kind that means, "I have already decided." Sophie said, "Please," in the tone she used when she meant it completely. Maria looked back at Charles. "I don't need a title," she said. "I just need them to be okay. They will be," he said. "We all will be." He walked to the pantry and reached to the top shelf for the cinnamon cookie tin that had sat there since Claire put it there years ago, and that nobody had moved, because moving it had always felt like the wrong kind of finality. He set it on the counter between all of them, and the smell that came up when he opened it, warm and familiar and specific to a woman. None of them had stopped missing, sat in the kitchen for a moment, like a presence. Then he closed it again gently and left his hand on the lid. "We do things differently now," he said to all three of them. "Starting today." The rest of the morning passed away. Mornings pass after something large has shifted slowly, carefully, each person moving through the same rooms and finding them slightly altered. Vanessa's departure was quiet. She came downstairs with 2 bags and a carry-on and did not come into the kitchen. The front door closed at 11:47. Charles heard it from the back garden where he was sitting with his daughters, and he did not go inside to check. He already knew everything he needed to know about what had just left. That evening, after Sophie and Grace had eaten and been read to, and finally fallen asleep in the easy, heavy way children sleep when they feel genuinely safe, Charles sat at the kitchen table with cold coffee and the velvet box in front of him. Maria came in and sat across from him without being asked, because 6 years had made formality unnecessary between them, and because he looked like a man who needed the room to not be empty. "Did you ever think about leaving?" he asked. "Before tonight, when it was bad?" Maria thought about it honestly. "I thought about the girls," she said. "Every time I thought about leaving, I thought about them, and that was the end of it." Charles nodded. He looked at the necklace box for a moment. "Claire would have liked you," he said. "She would have been grateful." He picked up the box and held it out toward Maria. She looked at it, then at him. "I don't need that," she said. "I know," he said. "It's not payment. It's just, she would have wanted someone she trusted to keep it somewhere it was safe." He set it between them on the table, not pressing, just leaving it there. "You can decide later." Maria looked at the box for a long moment. Outside, the Connecticut night was fully dark and very still, and the house around them was quiet in the way a house gets quiet when everyone in it is finally at rest. The danger doesn't announce itself. It doesn't kick down the door or arrive with obvious intent. It comes with good posture and a fluency in exactly the language you most want to hear. It learns your weaknesses not to help you address them, but to stand inside them. And it is patient because patience is the one virtue that never attracts suspicion. Charles had spent 2 decades reading people across negotiating tables, and he had still almost missed it because he had been looking at the wrong things. He had been watching the accusations instead of the accuser, watching the house he built instead of the people living inside it. The truth, it turned out, had been visible the whole time in the small, repeated, unwitnessed acts of someone who showed up the same way whether anyone was watching or not. Pay attention to how people treat those who can't give them anything back. The children, the quiet ones, the people in the room that power ignores. That is where the character lives. That is where the truth always eventually comes home.